Welcome to this 6-minute movie on Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. This is showing the significance or the symbolism of the grandmother's hat in the story. Now, all good Southern Christian women used to wear hats when they went to church. The reason for this is in the Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 5. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoreth her head. And no good Southern woman would go to church without this hat. She wouldn't go to church without the hat any more than she would without her shoes. And yes, it is as much about pride as it is piety. And this is one of the points O'Connor is trying to make here. So in this story, the grandmother has on her blue straw sailor hat with her little violets, and you can actually trace the symbolism or the path of her faith through what happens to the hats in the story. Now, in 2007, I went to Georgia to see Flannery O'Connor's homes, and I saw these hats in a hat store. Now, some of you might remember watching Obama's inauguration and seeing Aretha Franklin sing My Country 'Tis of Thee. Now, you might not have noticed or understood the significance of her hat, but I guarantee you that if you were a woman over 50 in the South, you were talking about Aretha's hat. And her hat was almost as important as her color. And again, this goes to the importance of the hat in the church in the South. Great book called Crowns, Portrait of Black Women in Church Hats. And so now we'll go to the reading. From A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of the chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal. "Now look here, Bailey," she said. "See here, read this." And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida, and you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around then and faced the children's mother, a young woman in slacks whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage and was tied around with a green handkerchief that had 2 points on the top like a rabbit's ears. She was sitting on the sofa feeding the baby his apricots out of a jar. "The children have been to Florida before," the old lady said. "You ought to take them somewhere else for a change so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. They never been to East Tennessee." The children's mother didn't seem to hear her, but the 8-year-old boy, John Wesley, a stocky child with glasses, said, "If you don't want to go to Florida, why don't you stay at home?" He and the little girl, June Starr, were reading the funny papers on the floor. "She wouldn't stay at home to be queen for a day," June Starr said, without raising her yellow head. "Yes, and what would you do if this fellow, the Misfit, caught you?" the grandmother asked. "I'd smack his face," John Wesley said. "She wouldn't stay at home for $1,000,000, June Starr said. "Afraid she'd miss something. She has to go everywhere we go." "All right, miss," the grandmother said. "Just remember that the next time you want me to curl your hair." June Starr said her hair was naturally curly. The next mother, the grandmother, was the first one in the car, ready to go. She had her big black valise that looked like the head of a hippopotamus in one corner, and underneath it she was hiding a basket with Pitty Sing, the cat, in it. She didn't intend for the cat to be left alone in the house for 3 days, because he would miss her too much, and she was afraid he might brush himself against one of the gas burners and accidentally asphyxiate himself. Her son, Bailey, didn't like to arrive at the motel with a cat. She sat in the middle of the back seat with John Wesley and June Starr on either side of her. Bailey and the children's mother and the baby sat in front, and they left Atlanta at 8:45 with the mileage on the car at 55,890. The grandmother wrote this down because she thought it would be interesting to say how many miles they had been when they got back. It took them 20 minutes to reach the outskirts of the city. The old lady settled herself comfortably, removing her white cotton gloves and putting them up with her purse on the shelf in front of the back window. The children's mother still had on slacks and still had her head tied up in a green kerchief, but the grandmother had on a navy blue straw sailor hat with a bunch of wild violets on the brim and a navy blue dress with a small white dot in the print. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy, trimmed with lace, and at her necklace she had pinned a purple spray of cloth violets containing a sachet. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady.